right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's ELGL webinar presented in partnership with the Davenport Institute at Pepperdine University. Today, we are talking about findings from the New Normal Survey, COVID's lasting legacy on local government. I'm ELGL Executive Director Kirsten Wyatt, and it's my pleasure to introduce and participate in today's presentation. ELGL is the Engaging Local Government Leaders Network, and we engage the brightest minds in local government. And one of the ways we do this is to provide exceptional and free online training about local government topics. We are so pleased to be partnering with the Davenport Institute, whose mission is to help build stronger communities by promoting public participation in local government. 599 local government officials and staff from across the country recently took the New Normal Survey, COVID's lasting legacy on local government, which was conducted in partnership with the Atlas, ELGL, CivicPulse, Civic Plus, and Route 50. It is a follow-up to a survey from June 2020. Last year, we asked local government leaders how public services were evolving due to COVID-19. And this year, we asked which of those changes are expected to be permanent. So the question we're really getting at is, what will the new normal look like for local governments? And it may look like the old normal, but with some notable exceptions. So today, we're really excited to be sharing with you the findings from this survey. So joining me today are our partners on this research project. Elle Hempen is the CEO and co-founder of the Atlas, now part of Route 50. Bill Lucia is the editor at Route 50. Nathan Lee is the founder and CEO of CivicPulse. And Jon Wiersma is the vice president of marketing at Civic Plus. And together, we all worked on this survey and analysis, and we'll share with you some of the highlights from the survey. As a reminder, all ELGL webinars are recorded and will be available later today on elgl.org. This is an interactive webinar. We would love to hear your questions. And so please use the chat box to ask those questions. And later on, if we have a discussion time, you can unmute yourself at that point. Let's see. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jon. He's going to moderate today's discussion. We have a slide deck that shows some of the findings, but we'll also paste into the chat the link to the survey report, so you have a chance to access that at your leisure as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jon.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Quick check, everyone can hear me okay? All right. So diving into the presentation, I don't know, do we want to give backgrounds on the panel, or should we just dive into the discussion? Just dive in? Okay.
Let's dive in, yeah.
We're diving in. So before we get into some of the key topics and findings that came out in discussion, we wanted to just give a little bit more of the profile information of the responders so that you have some context of the inputs that we're getting here. As Kirsten mentioned, 599 folks did participate and provide their responses. 69% of those were from municipalities, city governments, and the remaining 31% were county employees, special districts, and other utilities. It was across a very good range, geographically speaking, job title and role perspective, as well as size of organization. And I'll park there for a second. The representation here really captures the perceptions and leaders of what would normally be classified more as small to mid-sized communities, a group that tends to be less represented in public discussion and dialogue around government affairs and government policy. However, it's a segment of the country that represents most communities where we all live, work, and participate. And so we're really happy for this representation in some ways, to give voice to maybe other perspectives than typically get the normal attention. It wasn't perfectly representative of the breakdown. We know that there's a significant number of communities, if you're just looking at count, that are on the smaller side even than this representation, but we think it's a pretty good, maybe interesting perspective compared to most of the coverage and research that's out there. Titles I mentioned, so I'll move forward fairly quickly, but management represents the largest section of this. It tends to be audiences of the folks that are putting out the survey, so maybe no surprise there. But they do have a good view, typically, across their organizations and represent that. So a good cross section of the population, but certainly heavily skewed towards the management side. And so then as we roll into our first topic, we broke out a few of the findings into categories. And so just our first area for discussion was really COVID-19 stimulus only staunched the bleeding. And so we're going to dive into some of the funding topics around the last year. Obviously, it's a key component of all of our lives in government these days is the federal funding provided that's helping us recover and respond. So maybe I'll turn it to our panel. Bill, I know you've done a lot of coverage on this space for Route 50. Be glad to hear some perspectives from you.
Right. So I guess something to keep in mind about the survey findings here is the primary pot of money that people would be sort of thinking about or talking about in their responses here would be the CARES Act funding from last year. That was the $150 billion of state and local relief funds that flowed out. And a few caveats around those funds is that they were only available to local governments of 500,000 people or more, along with states. And compared to the American Rescue Plan funding, which is the more recent round of federal relief for states and localities, the CARES Act money also had some tighter restrictions around it in terms of how it could be used. So you saw a lot of places, using it for assistance programs to help businesses, renters and others kind of weather the economic downturn that COVID brought on. There was also, payroll was another way, certain eligible payroll was another popular way that some of the money was used, but things along those lines. So the real interesting thing going forward, I guess, is sort of thinking about, maybe thinking about some of the differences between this earlier pool of money and the funding that's coming out now, which is it's a much larger amount. It's also more flexible and it's going to more places.
It's an interesting point you raised. We'll get into some of the trends that folks are seeing, but certainly payroll was a use case there. If we're comparing from when we did the survey back in the summer of 2020, only 2% of respondents said that they didn't expect furloughs or layoffs in their organization. And then when we did this benchmarking here this spring, 28% of respondents reported that there were no significant layoffs or furloughs in their organization. So we certainly saw, maybe we can tie those things together to some of the funding and it coming through for organizations.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that the funding was very much used to staunch the bleeding, as the title slide said. I think that when we look at these numbers, one of the things that's clear, and we'll talk about some of the layoff numbers that are on the next slide, but really, like, libraries, parks and rec, community programs did not get a lot of love in the last year. And I think that's pretty fair. And I think people recognize that they were hit pretty hard. And unfortunately, those are the types of programs that residents, particularly in low income or brown and Black communities, really rely on. And so I see some of this data and think about the fact that some of the structural systemic issues might be getting further exacerbated by the last year, and definitely something that, as you're looking at the new funding that's coming out, I'm glad to see that it's being more directed towards kind of putting some capital behind those types of programs that can actually move the needle and help maybe dig out of a hole that's been built a little bit around community programs that are so essential to actually the functioning of communities.
Yeah, and one quick thing to add, like on the new round of funding, something interesting there too is I mean, some of that, I think one of the interesting dynamics to watch with that is how much of it is put toward sort of shorter term costs, backfilling budgets, things along those lines, and then how much is going to go toward like longer term one-time investments that might have to do with economic development or workforce training, things along those lines, because that's I think a big part of the conversation that's going on right now.
For sure. Anecdotally, we're hearing that too from local government officials that are saying it's so much money, right? The pots of money are so big that it's almost that they're thinking about what are some of the big projects that have been in the backlog that we can invest in that are fundamental and important to our development. Broadband, for example, being one that's kind of top of mind, but I think there's lots of those, and less about like how do we backfill the things that we maybe cut because of budget concerns, and how do we kind of leapfrog, which is great, I think, ultimately in some ways, right, and trying to move the needle on big priorities. But there's a lot of things that got cut that need to be backfilled, and so, you know, my hope is that as those conversations evolve, that they're thinking critically about what needs to kind of be brought back up to where it was before or improved around, and in addition to some of the big leapfrog projects that can be executed around using the funding.
That's interesting. Not to belabor the point, but we've heard some of the same through our channels of conversations with communities. The way it was kind of posed, I think, with one of the financial folks that I talked to, was that like a rising tide raises all ships, and so there was discussion about the use of ARPA funding and what they're going to use it for, but also in some regards just not the cuts they were making other places necessarily, so that there was actually a budget for projects, even though they weren't necessarily using ARPA for certain things, but because they weren't going to have to move funding to accomplish some project like preventative maintenance on a facility or something, that it didn't pull budget from other parts inside of the organization. So it's interesting to see the direct, but also the very indirect implications of that. I'll take us forward. And Nate put a point in the chat, and I think it's a good one. It's a fairly small group on the phone. We have this kind of bucket into sections. So I think folks can certainly come off mute and ask questions and chime in, particularly as we like hit the section breaks, kind of the different topics. Nate, you might have something to add on here. I know you guys have looked at a lot of the labor and workforce and government operation stuff.
Sure, yeah. So at CivicPulse, we've been running some of our own surveys as well on impacts of COVID, and one thing that's consistent with some of the previous comments by Bill and Elle is that a lot of the funding up until this last round was very much trying to just keep service provision alive and not having to fire, you know, half of your staff, and then some of the longer term capital investments were got the short shrift. And I think you see that in terms of who got hit hardest, with Parks and Rec being at the top, despite, you know, some pretty clear research that investments in parks and recreation in particular is not a luxury good, but really critical for a lot of people. And in fact, even if all you care about is sort of overall economic productivity, it turns out to be a very good investment, but it's still often seen as kind of a luxury good for community. So, but on the bright side, I think I'm comfortable saying that these numbers would have looked a whole heck of a lot worse, but for federal government stepping in. So, so it's definitely cup half full, half empty, depending on your perspective. If obviously you're someone who actually was laid off, you know, maybe more half empty. But I think going forward, hopefully, especially with the infrastructure bill coming, some of the verticals that were hardest hit will hopefully rebound the fastest too.
And, you know, from ELGL's vantage point, and, you know, thinking about our members and kind of seeing and hearing how they have weathered this past year, you know, we're always really focused on morale and how people are doing, and, you know, how their work experience is. And, you know, anecdotally, we've seen from these top two departments, you know, where layoffs were happening in Parks and Recreation and in Library. It was at the exact same time that those departments were dramatically pivoting and shifting how they provide services to continue to engage their community, you know, during this really challenging time. So things like virtual recreation classes, virtual story time, other community building activities, and then finding ways that they could continue offering services, whether it was for patrons to pick up books in a no contact way. And so, I think for us, it's been really interesting to think through, some of the departments that we're seeing, at least initially, the biggest impact. We're also doing some of the most creative changes to their operations and their work, knowing, and similar to what Elle had mentioned on the previous slide, that often these are the departments that have those strongest ties and connections to the community. And we're used to providing services to ensure that more of the community could engage with the local government. And so we'll talk about it on a future slide, but there obviously have been significant impacts on morale in local government employment. And I think that it's illustrative that the departments who were innovating the most, perhaps during this time, also saw the greatest number of layoffs, or at least reduction in force or reduction in service until things open up back to normal.
Yeah, and I guess I would just jump in and add here. I mean, we've tracked the Labor Department jobs figures over the course of the pandemic, and I mean, the latest ones show that in April, local government employment was still down by about 900,000 jobs compared to February 2020, just before the pandemic hit in full force here. About 600,000 of those jobs are in local government education, though. That's something to keep in mind. Reporting on that during the course of the pandemic kind of indicated that a lot of those education jobs, those were more support jobs rather than teachers. And then, lastly, with the jobs figures too, not all those job losses are layoffs. Some of them are furloughs. Some of them are, people, losses through attrition, positions that haven't been filled, things along those lines. So still a long way to go to getting back to where things were prior to COVID, for sure. So. John, you're on mute.
Thank you. We're going to be moving on to our next topic, which is workforce related. What we just wrapped up was really funding related. So I don't know if any folks in the chat want to put questions in or unmute and come off on the funding topic before we move forward.
While folks are thinking about questions, I just thought I'd put a plug in for a book that actually talks about those two hardest hit departments, Parks and Rec and libraries. If you haven't already heard of Eric Kleinenberg, he wrote a book called Panelists for the People, and it talks a lot about, he defines the term long before Biden did, called social infrastructure, and talks about the role of this kind of infrastructure for local communities. So Panelists for the People. I don't know the person, so it's not like just a genuine good read.
Perfect. Thanks for that plug. Speaking from Civic Plus's perspective, we watch a lot of the traffic on local government sites representing the market. But the interesting thing was when the pandemic did hit, we saw the spike in traffic of everyone searching for COVID and vaccine and closed and public health. And the interesting thing was that that was all March, early April. And in June, I think it was the last week of May, the first week of June, all of a sudden there was a spike that was as high as the spike for COVID and health related to hiking, green space, parks, activities, pool. That grouping of keywords actually spiked just as high in June, and year over year, it was over 100%, increase year over year of folks on the same week looking for that type of information. So it was interesting collectively as a country, we all kind of said like, okay, now how do I get outside? Which gives some context to the importance of those parts of the organization in those services. So rolling into our next topic, COVID-19 will impact the future of local government workforce. So we talked a lot about kind of the staffing component of it, but there's other components of workforce that the survey also addressed. Elle, maybe you can start us off with what you're seeing here.
Yeah, and I think Kirsten can probably talk a lot about the morale issue, right? There's good and bad here. Nobody wants to see, right, morale being hit, and that's not a good thing for lots and lots of reasons. But I do get excited about some of the data, right, that talks about, 53% of respondents said that this helped their organization uncover new leaders. Combine that with some of the data that we may throw out on the screen later about increases in use of data to make decisions and increasing data-driven decision-making and some of the tech adoption. It just signals like good things for modernizing government and how governments work and operate. And I think, again, other folks can speak about this more specifically. I also look at kind of the uncovering new leaders along with some of the information about retirements. And I think there's probably some thinking that's being done in local governments, or I know there's stuff being thought about in local governments about kind of the impending silver tsunami and what that means, and what this kind of experience that everybody went through over the last year means for not only burnout and making sure that we're managing morale, but also what that means for the workforce long-term, not only who's coming in and entering the local government workforce, but then what are they expected to do in terms of operating in a really, tech data-driven environment. So again, good and bad from my perspective, but I think we could dive in on each of these and spend a lot of time thinking about the implications of this particular data set on local government operations moving forward.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that we're seeing and hearing with our members as well. Members really struggling with burnout and fatigue, or I think that the new term is languishing. At our conference that we just held on Friday, we had a couple of different sessions on people who either stepped into or were asked to step into completely new roles in their organization to manage COVID recovery, and sometimes just with the uncertainty around that work, that lack of support, or that lack of knowing, am I doing it right, is definitely a concern that folks have brought up. The other thing I think is interesting, and we'll hopefully have some content to share in the next couple of weeks. HR departments have been, starting to track the use of the employee assistance or EAP programs, sick leave during the pandemic, leave to take care of family members, to take care of kids. So some of that data that's being tracked by HR offices will hopefully be able to share out both, the data itself, but then the stories behind the effect on the workplace. And then in terms of that morale challenge, the thing that I'm seeing and hearing quite frequently, and honestly probably too frequently, is the stress that comes from being called back into the office. Our research here, both this year and last year, showed that there really was, people really did enjoy the ability to have a more flexible schedule or to work from home. And so especially in organizations where they are mandating or requiring a return to work with, and then, losing that work from home or that flexible schedule option, I think that does cause stress. And just, kind of as a quick story, I received a text the other day from someone who had received their dream job during the pandemic, relocated for it, and was just ordered back into the office full time. They don't feel comfortable. They don't feel safe. And so that dream job is really kind of turned into a nightmare. And, I know that there's community pressure, that there's pressure to get things back to normal, but I do think that there could be a longer term effect on employee retention if the approach to return to work isn't kind of managed with a little bit of empathy and understanding, given that not everybody feels the exact same way right now about the safety of reopening. And also just the fact that folks have enjoyed government finally, stepping into the 21st century with flexible schedules. So I think that morale challenge will continue, and we'll continue to keep an eye on it and hopefully report out on what we're hearing and seeing.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I thought one of the interesting things here was the broken down silos statistic, and it's interesting given the cross-cutting nature of the crisis, and how it affected, issues around both public health and the economy, that maybe that figure wasn't higher, but then at the same time, like thinking back to all the reporting I've done over the years and how, people consistently say it's tough to break down silos in state and local government, then you see that, a third of people saying here that that is something that happens. So maybe, maybe that's actually, maybe that is actually a high figure, a noteworthy figure. And then second, on the retirement issue, something I'd just add there is, unlike the 2008 downturn, when people might have held on to their jobs because they were watching their, retirement funds get really slammed by a downturn in the stock market. This time around, the stock market actually has held up pretty well. So, people on the fence about retiring may have been, more comfortable making that decision this time.
A quick addition, an example to maybe put some meat on the bone here for the breaking down silos. I think one example to keep in mind is that most municipal governments don't have public health departments, and yet most municipal governments had to get in the business of public health. And so that was a responsibility that ended up being shared by a lot of different departments. And so it'll be interesting going forward, how that may get institutionalized or not.
That's an interesting point, Nate. What we've heard anecdotally anyway is, I guess maybe 2 points on that is maybe some of the less reduction in force than people anticipated might correlate to people getting repurposed into public health roles. We heard it from Parks and Rec in particular, folks that are used to interacting with the public, used to running programming. We heard of a lot of Parks and Rec organizations and staff getting to the business of handing out PPE, and then just more recently in the vaccine distribution business, as Parks and Rec facilities and staff. Elle, maybe you can kick us off on this one.
Sure. Kyle, your point is well taken. I'm glad that you first of all started your job during the pandemic, and I think your point aligns really well with the data, and that while there are a lot of local governments, as Kirsten mentioned, that are starting to come back to the office and encouraging that kind of behavior, it was exciting to see some of this data about the expectation that work from home and flexible schedule will stay on the table for some organizations, and that local governments have modernized to the point where they feel confident being able to run processes and still deliver services, even with team being 100% remote or some kind of hybrid. And I know as an organization ourselves, right, we've learned how to operate that way, and I think feel really comfortable being able to operate in kind of a hybrid model moving forward. So it's exciting to see this data reinforce that may be true for local governments as well. The other thing I'll just flag, and I think probably Kirsten and Bill and others can add more detail on the work from home flexible schedule. For me, what's really interesting here is kind of the emphasis around more training, but less travel. Obviously a huge drop off in travel over the last year, but I think historically, local government learning has oftentimes happened at these professional development conferences in person, and that expectation that travel will be down across the board, I think opens up a lot of questions about local government learning, both on conference attendance, like what do conferences actually look like moving forward. And I know ELGL has been doing a lot of thinking about how to make that happen. We're doing a virtual event right now, obviously. We've seen a lot of searching increase on our Atlas platform and our community to help enable local government learning about how different solutions are being deployed in cities across the country. So it's been at least exciting for us to see that kind of transition happen, but I'll be interested to track this over time and see how learning evolves in this community, over the next 5 years as a result of this kind of shock to the system.
It's just to tack onto that, and actually it goes right along with Sharice, your comment, that I think so as you may know, Kirsten, organization ELGL, and our organization CivicPulse does a lot of work on tracking diversity in local government. And I'm sure it'll come as a surprise to none of you that that there is a major diversity problem in local government, and there was also a great deal of concern that has been made worse by the pandemic because of the disproportionate burden on who's sort of been pulled out of the workforce. So one of the silver linings here, despite the fact that indeed it does seem like if you're saying that in your case, Therese, that actually this came up for you, like some local governments have maybe pulled people back in too soon, but the fact that at least in our survey, almost half of respondents are saying they think flexible schedules at least is here to stay. In the longer term, I think that bodes well for being a more accommodating work environment. So I'll be very curious, not just in the next few months, but in the next couple of years to see if that really leads to a step shift in who decides to fill these positions.
And one of the ELGL award programs recognizes the best places to work in local government. And we'll be releasing, kind of those winners in the next couple of weeks. But I will say as kind of a preview that, the award is nominated by employees. The award can't be nominated by a manager or a mayor or an HR director that's trying to, sell their organization. We really wanted this to be a grassroots effort, and the folks who nominated their agency are recognizing things like flexible schedules, work from home, paid family leave, some of those items that, have become even more kind of apparent that folks are looking for from employers right now. And so we're excited to share, how some of these local government agencies have made that happen. And then, back to what Elle was mentioning, one thing that we're paying a lot of attention to is how ELGL continues, our mission of connecting people who work in local government when we know that events going forward are going to be in a hybrid setting. So, obviously having hopefully some in-person component, but recognizing that training and travel budgets have been impacted, and people's willingness to attend in-person events has changed as well now that they've gotten more comfortable with online events. And so our plan for the future is to have hybrid events that have an online and an in-person component to kind of meet the needs of all types of people who in terms of how they're facing the pandemic right now.
Yeah, and I think just generally it's going to be interesting to watch, like Nate said, like over the coming year or two here, how reality stacks up against, what these survey results found. The pandemic showed that work from home and flexible work arrangements can work in a lot of cases with local government jobs, often in departments or, agencies or with governments where managers may have been skeptical of those kinds of arrangements previously. And, how much of it will actually stick? That remains to be seen. I think, also it seems like this, the flexible schedules, work from home seems like a very obvious, valuable recruiting tool. When you're talking about coming retirements and trying to attract younger workers into the government workforce, it seems like that's something there too, where places looking to attract those folks, it's something that they'd want to think about.
Yeah, interesting anecdotally, again, from hearing from client advisory boards and groups that we talk with, it was a city, I guess I won't name, said like their work from home policy was we don't work from home, right? Something to that extent. And, they ordered however many hundreds of laptops very quickly because they had a pretty savvy IT director and got them when they still could early on in February. So another component of this is that in addition to just seeing that it does work, is a lot more governments have the infrastructure for it at this point, from the computers to the telephone, even we're seeing a lot of migration of the products that people use to the cloud, which is much easier to operate in a work from home environment. And so maybe that's a hopeful piece as well, is that in addition to just perceptions, it's also just more physically and technologically possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, not just work from home, right? But also, I mean, if there were situations where people were going across town, maybe once a week to attend meetings or something like that, I mean, how will that change going forward? Where are the efficiencies there, where maybe people don't have to make those trips anymore? And then, I mean, you know, with governing bodies like councils and even legislatures, you know, I think there's some really interesting things to watch going forward about how remote testimony and things like that stick. So, I mean, it's not just work from home, but also, you know, other aspects of,
Yeah.
you know, what stays around with how this technology's been adopted.
Yeah, it's a good point. I had a discussion with a much larger organization recently, someone who worked there, and they were talking about how hard, because it's a really spread out county. You know, some folks will be driving an hour just to get across the county, and everybody has to be right at the central office. And meanwhile, there's, you know, across numerous towns within that county, there's open space. There's plenty of open office space right now, where a satellite office or hoteling suites can be put through. And just that, it was a challenge for folks to think that way until somebody brought the idea, and they're like, oh, heck yeah, like we could do that next week, you know, pretty easily. So. Good. Quick time check. We're rolling right along. I think this is a key topic for the attendees here. The next section we broke our findings down into was COVID-19 was and wasn't a game changer for community engagement. 79% of the respondents did report adopting technology to engage community members during COVID-19. I think the use cases of those technologies range and were very clear and obvious. But that's certainly a data point that calls out that there was some impact on community engagement and how it was done, which is kind of stating the obvious. But then we get into a lot more detail about maybe how and why that came through. So I'll turn it to our panel to provide some color.
Yeah, I'll jump in just by way of background from academic research. This is like a huge question in political science, which is how do you design systems and processes that promote effective and equitable engagement amongst constituents with leaders. And obviously the solutions depend on the level of government, depend on the size of the community. But in the last 20 years, you have the internet, and there was a lot of hopes and dreams pinned on that, and a lot of them never sort of came to fruition. And now it seems like there's this delayed shock to the system that has led to a very interesting natural experiment in new ways of doing civic engagement. And as background for this question, we asked one of the key research questions, keep in mind anytime you're introducing going from in-person to online, is that the hope is that you bring in more people, and hopefully that those more people also comes from a wider variety of, you get basically more participants, but also more diversity. And the concern is that if you're online rather than in person, people's norms around communication might go downhill a bit. People might be rude. There might be some people who jump in who are just doing it sort of to troll their council member and not because they actually want to say something about their community. So there's a concern about trade-off between quantity and quality. And from my standpoint, this finding here is very promising, because you see, at least from the vantage point of our survey respondents, that there was indeed an increase in quantity. There was indeed an increase in diversity, and there was not a decrease on net in quality. So I was sort of happily surprised at this, and that's my perspective.
He says that because we've debated this point a little bit. It's true, right? These are all, generally speaking, good things. I think when I look at these stats, though, when you talk about like tech adoption for online, right, community engagement, you think about step function improvements, like drastic major improvements in terms of how the process works and the diversity of voices that are included, the scale of voices. And I see these numbers and I see a lot of more of the same. So it's improved, expanded, but not a step function improvement. And I think all that signals is that like you can't put tech on a bad process and expect it to solve the problem. And I think, what is it? Who is it? Bryant, you just made this point in the chat, right? That ultimately, right, like expanding your toolbox of tools and technologies that enable you to reach out are only as good as the trust that you have with the community, the, you know, way in which you're engaging. And so there is just a lot of groundwork. There's a ground game here that has to get done in order for any of these technologies to actually help move the needle. They really are a means to an end, not the end in itself. As much as our friends and in the vendor community will say that they are the silver bullet, I think, right, everybody recognizes that these are tools that need to be used effectively and used appropriately and really resourced behind. And I hope that with the new funding that's coming out, that there is money that allows for that and that resources for that kind of community trust building and community engagement, because local government officials, they have to do the groundwork in order to actually make sure everybody's voices are heard. And so again, this data is good overall, but not a step function that I think we were hoping to see. So I'll be excited to see, you know, how this evolves now that the immediate push is over, and really if we can think about resourcing the teams to make these tools really effective.
And just to piggyback on that a bit, I mean, it's just a reminder too that community engagement software or platforms, it's not a set it and forget it kind of function. I mean, you still need to hire qualified communications and engagement professionals to manage these platforms, to keep an eye on them, to do the analysis. You know, some of the analysis that Civic Plus has been able to offer, you know, in looking at like the search functions and the terms that people are looking for, that sort of, you know, data-driven decision-making as it relates to engagement is still huge, and that requires that human element. And so, you know, a reminder that we can't purchase our way out of community engagement problems. We still really need to be focused on not just using some of these new tools that make it easier to connect when we're far apart, but then also making sure that we're hiring the right people to run them and manage them and then tell the stories based on the data that we're seeing behind the scenes.
Yeah, and we actually have, when I wrap up here, I'll actually be editing a story that will probably run tomorrow, and it's about you know, some of the community engagement techniques that places are using around the American Rescue Plan funding when it comes to, you know, getting feedback and input from their communities about how to put those funds to use. And so I think the community engagement aspects around that are going to be really interesting to watch. And, you know, I would point out too, I think just generally there's an appetite right now for more citizen input in budgeting processes. And, you know, it was especially heightened last year with some of the discussions around police budgeting and things like that, and just equity discussions more generally. So, you know, it's I guess I make the point just to say that, you know, even looking past the public health crisis here, there's a strong, you know, appetite to engage more strongly on some of these things going forward.
I saw that, Brian, you turned on your camera. I'd be curious if you had anything to add from your perspective as a community engagement official yourself.
Sure. So I've been working in a department. So I work with Richland County, which is surrounds Columbia, South Carolina, which is the center of the state here. And so our department is very unique. There is only one Department of Government and Community Services in all 46 counties of the state. So we have that going for us. And just as you guys have been referencing, I think the idea of what community outreach and engagement is supposed to look like is kind of where we find ourselves going. And so you've got a lot of departments that say, hey, like, we want to do this outreach. And when I ask them, like, you know, what level of engagement are you looking for from constituents? They're like, what? What do you mean? I mean, we just want them to know. And I'm like, okay, well, so are you wanting them to offer any input? Like, are you wanting them to be a part of the solution? They're like, well, we just need to get the word out there just so they'll know. And I'm like, so you don't want them to be involved? And it's like this really perplexed look of like, but I thought we were getting them involved. And I'm like, no, you've really already made up your mind. You just wanted to be able to say like, hey, here are some surveys that went out, and it kind of explains what I wanted to say. And so I think just in the part of, and I think we've learned too, we just did a huge survey with some neighborhoods, and learning that like, we're going to get responses back sometimes that completely go against what we thought the community, where they were going. And that's okay, because that's guided by the community. And so they should feel like their local government like is operating in like this democratic process of they're actually a part of the decision. They actually, you know, are part of the solution instead of just being bystanders in it. And so I say that knowing that we still have a monumental hill to climb with that. But I think, kind of as Ellie has mentioned, with like the online resources that exist, it's kind of like we think like we're just going to implement this like, and I'll use the basketball analogy, like we're going to just implement like LeBron James like into our program, and all of a sudden like everything's going to be perfect. And it's like, well, you still have to work within the system. Like you still have to have people that know what they're doing. And so I can have this fabulous system, but if nobody knows how to use it effectively, like we still are where we are. We just spend a lot of money on a system we can't really do anything with.
Thank you for sharing.
No problem.
Yeah. In Bill's point in wrapping up, I thought, I guess the bar is really high, or I don't know. I got kind of a goosebumps on it a bit as far as like it's a really critical time that we do this. So it's not just that we have the technology, or we're forced to by the need of the pandemic, but like these are times like where there's a lot of money to be spent on really big projects, for example, and that's a really blessing and a curse for a community, but also for an elected official or leaders of a community, because, you know, maintaining the status quo, you don't raise your head up too high in the positive or the negative. And so I think the stakes are pretty high, and there should be some motivation for the community engagement component if folks look at it from that perspective.
When we didn't pull the data in here, but some of the data in the survey talked about kind of the expectations of local government and how those have definitely increased, right? The next section that if we have time to, we'll get to, is all about kind of all the tech that has been adopted. And definitely this, right, there has been a ton of technology adopted, and with, right, like more technology sometimes comes more expectations. And so again, the thinking is that citizens are going to demand quicker, right, more responsive, more opportunities to engage. And now local governments have the tools to be able to do that. And so, Brian, to your point, it's about how do you make sure that like not only do you have the tools, but you have the team, the resources in place to actually ingest that information and act on it, sequence it in the right time frame, right, to actually be able to define how funds are being used and those kinds of things. So definitely increased expectations in local government, much more awareness that local government is on the front lines of basically everything that we're facing, which is, again, a blessing and a curse. It's good to have a spotlight on you, because I think local government leaders are making huge changes in our everyday lives. But it also means that there's just a lot of expectation, and particularly when it comes to community engagement, that those teams will be, you're doing God's work, Brian. You're on the front lines of dealing with that interface. And I think it's an exciting time to be a part of that part of local government.
Great discussion. We can roll into the technology piece, but I think if folks want to go off script, out of the outline, if there's more in the other parts of the study with the expectations, and let's roll with it. We did look into technology investment,
John, could I ask?
Certainly did change.
Could I ask just, if it's okay to go off script, could I just ask one sort of follow-on question to the group on this topic? Because I think it's a really critical part of all this, which is that how do we deal with, even if local officials, even if Bryant's team, I don't know how big Bryant's team is, so we'll just say Bryant is successful in his own in convincing staff and local government to make it a two-way street. There's this kind of elephant in the room, which is that constituent awareness, citizen awareness of local government is historically abysmal, and it might have improved. In fact, I think Pew Research has suggested it has, but it's still fairly low. And so just general knowledge of part of, I guess, citizen engagement has to also be educating citizens about what local government does. And so I'm just curious for the group, you know, how do we address that that challenge?
I'll just jump in and say I was having the exact same thought, so I'm glad I didn't want to bog down the conversation in this part of it. But yeah, I was kind of thinking the same thing. I mean, it's like that's a key challenge here, right? Is like making sure you don't just get the voices who are kind of the usual suspects in these, and when it comes time to get feedback. And I mean, especially in the budget context, right? It's like budget stuff is complicated. It's like anybody who's ever sat through like a city council, you know, budget hearing knows that that's not like the most gripping couple hours of your life sometimes. But it's super, super important. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I'd be interested to hear from Bryant or others too. Like, you know, where are the success stories in terms of like bringing new people into the conversation, getting kind of that livelier, you know, engagement from people who might not normally be heard.
So I'll jump in and say I think we took a really unique approach in trying to at the grassroots level engage with our community. And so we knew that we weren't going to be able to build this like rapport and trust like over the course of like a couple meetings, right? Like this idea that like I'm going to meet with a couple of agencies and organizations and business owners and all of a sudden like we're going to like work together is not going to be the way it happens. And so we've gone a step further in actually joining a lot of the councils and boards and committees that exist within our county. And it's given us a really unique behind the scenes look at what is happening, what are the true needs. And, you know, generally people will like talk with us and be like, we need funding for this and we need funding for that. And that is like the surface level of what we're talking about. In reality, it's more of the survey data that you're showing that like, hey, like we really don't have the capacity to handle these things. Like we need to educate people more about what we do and how we can work with them. We need to, you know, build more public-private partnerships, but I don't know what that looks like. So I'm just going to ask you guys for more funding. And so I think on that like grassroots level of really taking the time to talk with people, I think the doors begin to open up. And I'll give you guys an example. We, my first year here, we did a survey and there are 4 people on my team now. There were 3 of us then. And we did a survey, full-fledged did it, and we got maybe about 100 responses. This is calling, emailing, all this stuff. So we were like, okay, good. So now 3.5 years later, we did a survey and we got about 1,500 responses. And so that has been because we have the networks of people now that we can begin to talk to. And that was drastically suppressed because our department is also assisting with a emergency rental assistance program. So we were doing it for 2 months and we really only did it for a month. So we were kind of like, oh, I wonder what could have happened if we had done that for the extra month. But I think we had to pat ourselves on the back and say, like, look at the doorways that have been opened through that. And so now I think the critical part of that, and Bill, you may have been alluding to this too, is like, now what do we do with the data? Like, how do we actually make sure that gets to where it needs to get to so that people feel and know that we're working on their behalf, like we want to see things progress from that, so that they continue to look to us to help them in the future. Right. And I think that's that bridge that once that's built, I think that that's when the people come out of the fold because they're like, well, if I work with them and do stuff with them, like they really care about us, they want to help us, versus the people that get the survey from you once a year and then you never hear from them until another survey comes out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to reinforce we did an office hours with Kathy Bailey, who's the head of the Greater Cincinnati Waterworks program. And she tells a great story about as they were doing their kind of lead program, lead service line program, that they're a huge success story. But one of the things that she credits to their success is she sent the same people to the same community meetings over and over and over again, month after month, for a long period of time to just be there, be a part of the community. That consistency was really key. And that ultimately, like, by showing up and being present and participating and showing that you're there as a part of the community as well was such a huge delta. And then being able to open the door to have productive conversations. And to your point, Brian, uncovered all sorts of things that they could be doing or they should be doing to really support kind of the needs of the community. So it's just reinforcing the example that you're setting already. Another story that reflects back on you, the great work.
Awesome.
Brian, have you guys ever pushed surveys out through like non-official channels, like through community groups and things like that, to try to get wider distribution, or like to get them to audiences that maybe official government channels won't reach?
Yeah, we've done everything from hand delivery to we've also used POCO. You use online platforms, newsletters, gone to community meetings. We've done like every which way we could to grab those. And so we stopped the survey almost 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we still have some that are pouring in from paper surveys that we're going out and collecting, because we said we wanted to make sure your voice was heard. So even if a little longer to get it back, we want to be able to do it. So yeah. I'm so sorry, y'all. I've got to hop off and jump to another.
Well, it was nice talking to you.
It's going to be disengaging this time, but this has been like phenomenal to share. And thank you guys for, the surveys and the information, because this is great. I mean, I always enjoy these, but this has been really, really great.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's good talking to you. Have a good afternoon.
You too.
Oh, Jonathan, if you're talking, you're on mute.
Great. So we're at the conclusion of the survey. I do want to encourage folks, visit the ELGL, visit the Atlas, get a copy of the survey report. We didn't cover even all of the topics that were in the readout, and then join the conversation. Social handles are here. The more we can have some dialogue around this on an ongoing basis, obviously we love it. We ran over an hour in no time. So join the conversation, and thanks everybody for today.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks to the Davenport Institute for partnering on this series of community engagement webinars. This recording, as well as the prior 4 weeks of webinars that ELGL and the Davenport Institute worked on together, are available on elgl.org. We'll also send you a follow-up email and just make sure we include the link to the full report, because as I think we all have seen, there's a lot of content in there, a lot of helpful information that may help your local government either kind of change the approach that you're currently taking or justify the approach that you're taking. And that really has been a goal for all of us in conducting this research. So again, thanks to all of our partners on this. Love working with all of you, and thanks to all of our attendees who joined us today. So have a great Tuesday. Talk to y'all soon.